China and Russia met with the leaders of Hamas.
The senior Hamas member made the remarks during an interview with the Lebanese news channel last Thursday. Back in October, Hamas representatives met with Russia's special envoy and Iranian deputy foreign minister in Moscow. China's special envoy to the Middle East also traveled to Qatari capital Doha on October 19th. Doha is home to Hamas's leader and other members of the group's leadership. Beijing has provided no details on the trip. As for what's behind the alleged diplomatic moves, the Hamas official made a bold statement, alleging a potential anti-U.S. alliance among, quote, all of America's enemies.
The day may come when they join the way together and turn America into a thing of the past.
The official's claims comes amid the ongoing Israel-Hamas war. There's also a growing movement to push back on the Western-led global order and rule of law involving countries like Iran, Russia, and China. Plus, Hamas now has another potential ally, North Korea. In the interview, the Hamas official praised Pyongyang for its alleged ability to strike U.S. soil, referring to the regime as, quote, part of our alliance. Israel earlier said the terrorist group used North Korean weapons in their October 7th attack, killing over 1,400 Israelis. Pyongyang denied the allegation. As of now, neither Russia nor China have condemned the Hamas terrorist attack. China has refrained from describing Hamas as terrorists and has put pressure on Israel to stop bombing Gaza. A former Hamas leader earlier claimed that Beijing is taking notes on their terrorist attack and could replicate it for Taiwan. Are young people supporting Hamas because of TikTok? That's the case a congressman is making, saying the U.S. should completely ban the Chinese platform. NTD's Arian Pasdar spoke with an expert on Chinese propaganda.
Congressman Mike Gallagher wrote an op-ed for the Free Press saying many young Americans support Hamas because of TikTok. He cited a poll which says that over half of college-aged Americans say Hamas attacks on Israel on October 7th were justified. Gallagher wrote that a growing number of Americans rely on TikTok for their news. Today, TikTok is the top search engine for more than half of Gen Z. Official numbers from TikTok show that posts with the hashtag Free Palestine are getting around 17 times more views than posts with the hashtag Stand with Israel. This may come to no surprise, as former leader of the Palestine Liberation Organization, Yasser Arafat, visited China 14 times before he died. He met with CCP leaders, including Mao Zedong and Jiang Zemin. Congressman Gallagher wrote, "We know for a fact that the CCP uses TikTok to push its propaganda and censor views that diverge from the party line." And he concludes by saying that completely banning TikTok in the US protects our public square from the surveillance, malign influence, censorship, and propaganda of a foreign adversary. Now, to learn more about China's online propaganda campaign surrounding the Israel-Hamas war, I spoke with Jake Denton. He's a research associate in the Tech Policy Center with the Heritage Foundation. Denton tells me China is using this war to emerge as a more influential power than the United States. Take a look.
So when they have the ability to either diminish the role of the United States or to, target another Western country, it's to their advantage to push content that promotes the alternative view, one that makes China look more respected. And
Denton says he agrees with the congressman that TikTok should be banned completely. He also warns if Congress doesn't take the necessary steps, it could have a long-lasting impact on the United States, being shaped by information coming from the Chinese Communist Party.
What that results in is a generation that doesn't value the United States, that really doesn't like our own way of government. And so what you have is potentially a generation of citizens who identify closer with China's worldview than our own. And there's no telling of how that ends for us.
He says the United States is already seeing the impact of this among young Americans, and that it will only get worse if things don't change. Arian Pastar, NTD News.
China has become doesn't need to escalate.
He said that the war is like good versus evil, and the U.S. stands with the good.
Funding protection for religious groups. Senate leader Chuck Schumer wants Congress to allocate over $1 billion to that cause. He says bigotry has reached a boiling point. Schumer says intolerance against Jewish organizations has been on the rise since the October 7th attacks by Hamas. He told the New York Post, the thing that religious leaders, particularly our Jewish religious leaders, have clamored for is more money for the nonprofit security grant program. He said the program has been very successful, but the money has more or less run out. The grant allocated $300 million for the fiscal year, which ended in September. Schumer wants to bring the number up to $1.2 billion. That's after an increase in attacks against Jewish Americans. Just over the weekend, an anti-Israel protester painted the White House fence red while demanding a ceasefire in Gaza. Protesters also tried to climb over the fence. Up next, an investigation is underway after alleged writings of the Tennessee school shooter were published online. Find out more about how parents and Nashville authorities are reacting.
And a dive boat captain found guilty of neglecting his duty. More on the seaman's slaughter conviction years after his dive boat caught fire and sank. In just a moment here on NTD News Today.
Today will cast ballots to choose governors in Kentucky and Mississippi, decide legislative control in Virginia and New Jersey, and determine whether the Ohio state constitution should protect abortion access. NTD's Daniel Monahan breaks down some key races.
Off-year votes get less attention than presidential and midterm congressional elections. But Republicans and Democrats will be watching some major races and key issues for clues about the 2024 elections. First up are races for governor. In Kentucky, Democratic Governor Andy Beshear is running for re-election against Republican State Attorney General Daniel Cameron in the typically conservative state. Cameron is challenging Beshear by focusing on public safety, learning loss from school closures during the COVID pandemic, and legislation opposing cross-sex procedures on minors, which Beshear vetoed. In Mississippi, Republican Governor Tate Reeves is running for re-election against Democrat Brandon Presley, a second cousin of singer Elvis Presley. Reeves has accused Presley of being backed by out-of-state liberals. Presley is running on the promise of tax cuts and expanding Medicaid. Turning to the legislature, all 40 seats in Virginia's Senate and 100 seats in the House of Delegates are up for grabs. Democrats are fighting to hold or widen their 22-18 advantage in the Senate and win a majority in the House, where Republicans have a 52-48 edge. Democrats have focused on abortion access, as Republicans have promised to pass a 15-week abortion ban if they take control of the legislature, while Republicans have focused on crime and public safety. In New Jersey, all seats in the General Assembly and Senate are in play. Republicans have gained ground in the deep blue state since 2021, when they flipped 7 seats. They are campaigning on issues ranging from the economy to parental rights. Over to ballot initiatives, Ohio voters will decide whether to enshrine abortion access rights in the state constitution and on legalizing marijuana for recreational use. And finally, to the courts. The race for a new state Supreme Court justice in Pennsylvania will not alter the liberal tilt of the state's highest court, but could have future implications for abortion access and election laws in the state. Planned Parenthood has endorsed Democratic candidate Daniel McCaffrey for the 10-year position, while pro-life groups are backing the Republican candidate Carolyn Carluccio. Democrats have a 4-2 majority in the partisan state court, with 1 vacant seat to be filled in this election. Daniel Monahan, NTD News.
Welcome to our show. Thanks so much for joining us. To begin with, could you provide an overview of the gun rights case that's being heard by the Supreme Court today, and specifically the legal issues that are being examined?
Sure. This case is called United States versus Rahimi, and it concerns a federal statute that requires, that holds illegal individuals who are subject to a domestic violence protective order from possessing firearms. So what happened in this case is Mr. Rahimi was required under Texas law. He was subjected to a protective order for domestic violence, and in a subsequent search of his home for a subsequent crime, police officers found a firearm, and this United States statute kicked in and held that possession was illegal under federal law. So what's at issue in this case is whether the Second Amendment, which guarantees every individual the right to keep and bear arms is violated by a federal statute that disarms individuals that weren't convicted of any crime, but were subjected to this protective order for domestic violence.
So what are the arguments regarding the Second Amendment from both sides on this point?
Sure, it's a really interesting case because this comes in the wake of a previous Second Amendment case last year where the Supreme Court decided what the standard of review for these types of cases is. It's not strict scrutiny or intermediate scrutiny, these terms we usually hear in the law, but instead it's whether there's a history and tradition of these types of regulations in the United States. So the argument from the federal government is there is no history and tradition, or there is a history and tradition of disarming individuals for certain crimes like this at the founding. Conversely, the argument of Mr. Rahimi is that those statutes that disarmed individuals at the founding were done after sort of due process and a hearing and a conviction, whereas a protective order for domestic violence has none of those typical due process requirements.
And so how might the Supreme Court balance this need for protecting public safety and also individual rights within the context of the Second Amendment?
I think it's a really interesting issue for that reason. Obviously, nobody wants domestic violence abusers carrying firearms. It's a serious problem in America, and the Supreme Court has to wrestle with that. At the same time, infringing on individuals' fundamental rights, and every individual in America, unless they lose their fundamental right to possess a firearm, should have that constitutional right. So the Supreme Court is really taking a very interesting case to apply its new test for the first time. And I think a lot of court watchers are looking to see how this case is going to shake out.
Yeah, what are the potential implications of this decision in this case?
Yeah, so bottom line is either this statute is going to be held unconstitutional, in which case the Supreme Court will ultimately be saying that you need to afford people more process, you need to have more evidence that an individual is dangerous before you can disarm them of their Second Amendment fundamental right. Or the Supreme Court is going to say domestic violence is such a huge issue in this country, and there are historical analogs, that this statute does survive that heightened scrutiny.
And how would you say that this case impacts the public discussion on Second Amendment rights and on gun control generally, as it stands with the climate today?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. I think it falls squarely within that debate because you have on one side a serious national issue, domestic violence, and firearms within the home that we all know is serious. But at the same time,
and they often get used.
The constitutional right to keep and bear arms is a fundamental right that's within the Bill of Rights, and individuals have the authority to exercise that right unless they are convicted of a crime, usually. So this case really falls squarely in the middle of those two camps, and it'll be interesting to see how the Supreme Court rules in this case.
Do you have any sense of which direction it might go in?
I've learned not to prognosticate too much. I do think that both sides here have very compelling cases. I think, as a public interest attorney myself, this probably wouldn't be the plaintiff that I would want to bring to the Supreme Court to wrestle with this issue. But sometimes the Supreme Court has to do that with tough cases. And so it's a hard case. I think it's going to be a very interesting decision.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Joshua Thompson.
I'm getting a 3.2% increase on my Social Security. And I'm going to go down, sign paperwork, and find out how much my rent's going to go up. Somebody said theirs went up $4. Last year it only went up $1. And that was the highest increase we've ever gotten. Now, the dollar ain't going the way it should with ESG. It ain't working for nobody.
Biden's presidency and the rapid decline in American standard of living, as $5 of pay now buys only $4.25 of goods and services. Yet Democrats in Congress and the Biden White House insist the economy is as healthy as ever. Not only has President Biden's inflation crisis harmed working families, but it has also endangered millions of seniors and those nearing retirement. Right now, 25% of Americans plan to delay their retirement, and 62% of women say they expect to retire later or don't believe they will ever be able to retire because of inflation. Every single day, roughly 10,000 baby boomers reach retirement age. Yet due to the president's cost of living crisis, 1 in 6 seniors are considering going back to work. The number one reason they cite is simply lack of money. Seniors who retired before President Biden took office haven't been spared either. Inflation has eroded retirement accounts for even the most diligent savers. For example, a retirement portfolio valued today at $250,000 would buy the same amount of goods as $137,100 in 2000. Make no mistake, the Democrats' reckless spending agenda caused this problem. And now their radical ESG agenda threatens what's left of seniors' retirement. Democrats are trying to enshrine so-called environmental, social, and governance ideology into America's financial system by removing protections for savers in the tax code. This political crusade threatens the $33 trillion Americans have saved for retirement. As a committee, we have responsibility to ensure that tax-advantaged retirement plans offer security to American seniors and future retirees. The tax code imposes strict requirements on every professional who manages tax-advantaged retirement plans in order to protect our seniors. The law states that state governments and the private sector must manage these accounts for the exclusive benefit of retirees. This standard has been in place for decades, and it predates rulemaking by the Department of Labor on fiduciary duties. Working families need that protection to prevent Wall Street money managers from putting climate alarmism and far-left policies ahead of their retirement security. But over the last couple of years, we've seen the ESG agenda turn into a pressure campaign that allows, in some cases, forces investment advisors to gamble with retirees' nest eggs. According to Bloomberg, investors have pulled back over $280 billion from ESG targeted stocks since August of last year, and for good reason. According to our staff analysis of the top 20 ESG investment funds, ESG funds performed 18 percentage points worse than the stock market as a whole during the past year. A report on ESG investing produced by the Committee to Unleash Prosperity cites a review published by Boston College in 2020 that found, quote, pension funds with an ESG orientation lag those of non-ESG funds by 2 basis points per year over a 10-year period. Requiring retirement plan managers to invest in ESG funds is reckless and a danger to the system. We have the responsibility to protect as members of the Ways and Means Committee. The Trump administration's Department of Labor issued rules prohibiting Wall Street managers from investing Americans' retirement savings in woke ESG special interest. The purpose of the rules was to remind retirement plan managers of their sole responsibility: protect and build retirement security. The Biden administration reversed course with a superseding rule that favors ESG activism, and then went as far as to veto a congressional resolution back in March that would have corrected this error. This committee has a duty to ensure that our tax rules support Americans' financial security. We have a responsibility to put the needs of seniors ahead of climate extremists and far-left activists who want to use retirement savings to finance a political agenda. I hope my colleagues on the other side of the aisle will do what's right and join us in protecting our seniors. I look forward to today's discussion, and I'm pleased to recognize the ranking member, Mr. Neal, for an opening statement.
We are tuned into the House hearing on ensuring that woke doesn't leave Americans broke, protecting seniors and savers from ESG activism. We just heard from the House Ways and Means Committee Chair Jason Smith, a Republican from Missouri, talking about seniors and Americans who money is on the line and suffering in the face of inflation. He's saying that the Biden administration, since the Biden administration took office, the cost of goods has risen 17.7%. He says, $5 gets you what $4.25 would get you basically when Biden took office.
And a striking statistic you brought up as well was that 62% of women in the U.S. are expecting not to retire at all, or at least are planning to extend their retirement due to this this inflation, and not expecting to be able to have enough money if they don't. So
that's right.
So in this context, people's retirement funds are very precious, and prioritizing having enough money is becoming much more in the spotlight, and people are really feeling the consequences of it. And so partly this hearing is really about looking at whether fund managers are properly managing the funds of retirement funds to ensure that people do walk away with enough money to last them to the end of their days.
That's right. And Congressman Smith was also saying that, the Biden administration says the economy is healthy and doing better than ever. Despite
right.
The different inflation that we've been talking about. He's also saying that seniors and those nearing retirement are actually considering going back to work due to lack of money. He says that's the number one cause, lack of money.
That's true. It's sort of a nationwide phenomenon, not just for women, but it seemed more extreme to me, the idea of never retiring. That's only a few people face that traditionally, I assume. Now, we also heard from the congressman about, as you mentioned, the denial of this issue within the economy by the Biden administration, but also the laws that do already exist in terms of that fund managers really should be prioritizing the funds and the people who are investing in those funds. And he also talked about the history of that, where within the Trump administration they had prioritized that, and that Biden reversed that.
That's right. He's saying that these tax-advantaged retirement plans, like your IRAs, 401ks, the law states that the money managers in charge of those accounts must prioritize must benefit retirees, and that must be their priority. And already we're seeing those kinds of laws come into question here.
And so, Chris, just to begin and go back a few steps for our viewers, what is ESG?
Right, ESG.
Ambassador and South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley for her record on China. He accused her of rolling out the red carpet for Beijing.
Her record is writing the Chinese ambassador love letters saying, how great a friend China is. No, they're not a friend.
But former Governor Nikki Haley denies those accusations. She says she views China as an enemy, and that China has been practically preparing for war with the U.S. for years. Other than DeSantis and Haley, presidential candidate Vivek Ramaswamy is also taking a tough stance on China.
I see a lot of other candidates. Many of them will be on that debate stage, dancing around the really difficult issues we need to answer. How do we advance American interests? How do we focus on our real adversary, Communist China, and declare independence from them, while staying out of World War III, which we are closer to any time in my lifetime than we've ever been?
The third Republican presidential primary debate is scheduled for Wednesday in Miami. A California congresswoman asking entities worldwide to pull support from a Chinese logistics platform. In a recent letter, Congress member Michelle Steele argued the platform could give the CCP a roadmap to gain a stranglehold on the arteries of global trade. She added that its data could help Beijing identify transportation paths to control the movement of goods, and that using it is actively risking our national security and the security of our allies. She's calling attention to Log Inc., It was constructed and put into use by several Chinese state ministries and is used by shipping ports around the world. The platform linked with International Port Community Systems Association in 2017. And later, it joined the world body's network of trusted networks in 2022. According to the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review, Log Inc. has cooperation agreements with at least 24 ports, free ports and port operations outside of China, including 9 in Europe. Instead, she's introducing a bill that would direct U.S. departments to work with international government organizations to develop an alternative, secure platform. Australia's Prime Minister is meeting with Chinese leader Xi Jinping. It's the first time for Albanese to visit China after he took office in 2022. What is Australia expecting to get out of the visit? And what does it mean for China? Let's dive in.
As the West swings from decoupling to de-risking with China, a close U.S. ally, Australia, is attempting to take one step closer toward Beijing. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese met with Chinese leader Xi Jinping on Monday in Beijing. He zeroed in on increasing trade with China.
China is our most important trading partner. It represents more than 25% of our exports, and 1 in 4 of our jobs relies upon our trade. So it's an important relationship.
China also set a positive tone during the meeting. Xi said the two countries now share a sound and stable relationship. Signs of a thaw between them started showing weeks ahead of the meeting. Beijing released an Australian reporter last month after 3 years in detention. While
politicians and media outlets of weaponizing his past drug addiction. In an op-ed to USA Today, Hunter Biden wrote, "My struggles and my mistakes have been fodder for a vile and sustained disinformation campaign against President Biden." He asked that the, quote, weaponization of his addiction hurts others, addicts, who are trying to get
Oh
sober.
my God.
Hunter Biden's op-ed comes amid multiple investigations in Congress, including probes into his business dealings in China and Ukraine. He could face up to 15 years in prison on a false statement charge and up to 10 years on a drug-related charge. The head of FBI this week alerting senators to cyber threats from China. That's as the Biden administration seeks to get ahead of Beijing to govern AI. And joining us to discuss is James Shanowski, a senior policy analyst in technology and innovation for a national think tank, Americans for Prosperity. James Chernowski, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So first, let's talk about the latest testimony from FBI Director Christopher Wray this week on threats to Homeland Security. He warned that China has been using cyber operations to target American research, specifically trying to get dual-use technology that can be used in real-world conflict. As an expert on technology policy, tell us about the threat we're facing in this regard.
Yeah, I think that the documentation of China's actions when it comes to stealing intellectual property or going and engaging in cyber activities to target critical infrastructure, that's been pretty well documented. But it's not just China. We know North Korea and Russia were also other actors that Christopher Wray highlighted. But really what this amounts to, I think, is undermining why it's so important that the United States more broadly, not just from the private sector, but from the government too, invest in continuing to engage in basically doing cybersecurity education, so that way people are not as susceptible to the phishing attacks and other kinds of tactics and social engineering that these actors will use to get access to the sensitive information that these companies and the government might have. So that is really important, and Christopher Wray, I think, is just trying to highlight why it's so problematic that it's happening from these countries. And I think that ultimately, you don't want to focus on just focusing on how to punish China for its actions here, but really it's more about what can we do to mitigate the downside effects of these kinds of cyber incidents. Last year in 2022, there were over 800,000 cybersecurity incidents that were reported to the FBI, totaling over $10 billion in damages. And the thing is that it's going to continue to persist as we look forward, and that's why we need to invest in improving our cybersecurity awareness as well as our cybersecurity defenses.
And now let's dive into the topic of artificial intelligence. You said before that the U.S. and China are in a, quote, space race for AI dominance. So what are the stakes of this race? Eric didn't leave the stand until after the state confronted him with evidence that he signed off on estimates of some of his father's properties. He said he relied on his accountants and attorneys to ensure those estimates were accurate. The judge has said that the assets were inflated to win favorable terms from lenders and insurers. Eric said one of the lenders, Deutsche Bank, made hundreds of millions of dollars from doing business with Trump, something the judge has not disputed. But the focus of this trial is on how much more money the bank could have made if not for the alleged fraud. Eric said the truth will come out. The state's attorney will